My name is Jennifer Mason. We're in a session today that's about automating an expense request solution. So this is really about utilizing SharePoint 2010. So Steve kind of talked about in the keynote how it's about learning what you can do in 2013, but it's also about getting the most of what you guys can do with SharePoint 2010. So this is one of the few sessions this week that's going to be all about SharePoint 2010. So it's a 4-part series, and I have got a solution that's going to talk about an expense request solution that's got InfoPath, Excel services, workflows, Visio services, all of these different things combined together into a single solution. So we are going to start out this morning. I have some contact information up here. So this is where you can find out information about me, the blog posts that I have, different things along those lines. So if you guys want to copy that, I think the slides are available for you guys also as attendees, but the slide deck for all of the presentations are available on my blog right now. Okay, so we are going to talk about our process. We're going to talk about the importance of planning and design and talk about creating the form. So in each of the 4 sessions that we have today, we're going to talk about the form, then we're going to look at how we can take Visio services to help extend and enhance our process, and then we're going to look at how we're automating different things, and then just look at some basic things about site design and different things that you can do along those lines. So we're going to start out with just the basic form. We're going to talk about the problem that we're looking to solve, the importance of building a plan, and then building the form. So how many of you guys in here are using just SharePoint 2010? Okay, is anybody on Office 365? Okay, my solution set is built on Office 365. Any of you guys have plans to upgrade in the future pretty soon, or think you'll be on 2010 for a while? Yeah, okay. All right. I like to poll the audience and see where you guys are at before we get to talking. The problem that we're going to solve, and what I will say about any business solution that you build inside of a SharePoint demo, is that every organization is totally different. So I understand fully that the demo that I am going to build today probably has nothing to do with your organization, okay? But if you can just imagine with me that you have a similar situation, hopefully you'll be able to take bits and pieces of some of the content that we're working with and apply it across many different scenarios. So as someone who does a lot of SharePoint demos, I try to create sample scenarios that are going to hit a lot of different topics so that hopefully you'll be able to look at that and say, well, I can't use all of it, but I could use this piece or I could use that piece. So our scenario that we're working with is that users need a way to request money that they can spend within their department, and managers need a way to see all of the requests and approve them based on overall department needs. So you've got a group of users, they want to spend money. You've got a group of managers, they need to approve the money gets spent. Our current solution is that an email is sent to the managers for their approval, manager approves it, money gets spent. But if the manager is not looking at the whole context, you're going to get one manager that's quick to say yes to everything. You're going to get another one that's going to say no. Then you're going to end up with a department where some money is getting spent for different things and not really looking at a whole total solution. So what we've done in our final solution is that we have a single spot where they can go and request expenses, and then the organization is going to have a group of managers that comes, reviews the expenses, then they can see what things have been spent along the way. So this is the sample scenario that we're working with in today's solution. So I'm going to hop over and show you guys our final solution. Okay. So we have just a simple SharePoint site here. Maybe move a sec. Okay. So just a simple SharePoint site where users can go in and they can create an expense report. They can see what they have. They see that they have their submitted expense reports. They can review the approval process. When I click on this, it's going to take me to a page that's going to load up a Visio diagram that shows the entire process that things are going through. So I'm just consuming data here. Take a second to load. We'll come back and get that guy. So there's really nothing in this solution that would differ between Office 365, on-premise, anything. They're all exactly the same. So there's nothing in this that's going to give you any of those types of issues. So everything that I'm doing is completely out of the box. So you shouldn't run into any of those issues where it's going to work in one spot versus another. Yeah. Okay, so we see we've got the thing here. There's also a couple of different dashboards that we have here. And this is what we're going to get to in the future sessions this morning. My internet connection just went extremely slow. Okay. All right. I am not going to. Here's a page that's already preloaded. I'll show you this one. So this is an example of one of the sites where we're using Excel services to just kind of show some of the data from previous things. So this is a group that, they go in every month, they update their expense data, and then they're able to display this on a page so that they can go in and see the information that's there. We've got this dashboard here that shows items in a process queue, and as you click on different stages throughout the diagram, the page is going to reload and show you the associated information. So it's going to show us what expenses are authorized. And so we're trying to pull together a whole scenario and a whole solution that's going to guide people through the process. So the first step is we're going to have a form that we're going to have to fill out. And so in this session, we're going to cover all of the pieces about the form. But then it's so much more than just getting the form to the users. We actually want to figure out what type of environment can I build within SharePoint and what tools can I build within SharePoint to build this comprehensive solution so that all of the pieces come together to build just a single experience where they can go and complete tasks and function together. Because the more you can give them guidance of what you're trying to do, the easier it is to get them to follow a process that we have. Okay, so here's our final solution, and we're going to keep going back and forth to this throughout the entire presentation. Let me get back to... Okay. So we are going to go in and look at the planning and design. So we went back for our final solution here, then we have our planning and design, and the first thing we're going to look at is our requirements. The who, what, why, when, where, who's going to be using this, why, what are they going to be doing with it. We're going to go through and build out some process flow charts, look at our security restrictions. These are all of the things you want to do for any SharePoint solution when you get started. And then we're going to use a site design mockup. So before we get too far into building anything, we are going to go out and build an example of what it should look like on the site. Okay, so there's a tool that I use a lot for this called Balsamiq. Don't know if you guys are familiar with that tool or not, but there are several different, give you guys a link to it, several different links here. They have a 2010 SharePoint template and a 2013 SharePoint template. Those are actually community-built templates, but you can download the templates and then use them inside of Balsamiq to kind of map out what the SharePoint site would look like. And one thing that I have found when you start working with your users is that a picture is worth 1,000 words. When I can show them what it is that I'm trying to build out, it really helps us determine if we've gotten to the same point with the requirements. So a lot of time can be spent in building a form or in designing something, and then they look at it and say, that is not really what I had in mind, even though it's exactly what they said they wanted, but they didn't know what they didn't know. And so by using these tools, you can really save yourself a lot of development time because you can go out, map it out on the screen, and then it will lead to the right conversation. So it doesn't solve the problem of, getting the right requirements, but it leads to asking the right questions. You can tell a lot by body language. When you show someone a picture, you can tell if they relate to it, if they don't relate to it. And so even when I am building the simplest of InfoPath forms, I will actually go do a mock-up tool and I will go show them. Now, Balsamiq is one of my go-to tools that I use, but I make my tool match my audience. Sometimes I'll do it in Word, sometimes I'll do it in a whiteboard, sometimes I'll do it in Visio. It really doesn't matter what tool I use to do this, it just matters that I do it. So I spend a lot of time drawing out pictures to hopefully save myself time of doing things later, because a lot of times they don't understand necessarily what they want until they can see it. So again, it doesn't solve all of the issues with requirements, but it helps lead to the right conversations. And that's really the best that you can get to inside of SharePoint. A lot of my users, if I can lead them to the right conversations, then we can have those conversations, then we can fix it for the next piece of the puzzle. Okay. So then we're going to talk about building the form. So I want to come over and show you guys this, the final form again. We have got a form where they're going to come in, and there's a couple of different things about this form. This is always a dreader, yeah, presentation's worst nightmare. I'm going to come up here and have internet issues. And I put the site on the internet because I actually, when we get into the next session, for anyone who's got a laptop or anything like that, I have a username and a login so you guys can actually log into the demo site and see the content as we're going, because I know sometimes it's easier when you're going in and looking at a presentation if you can kind of click around and do things. So I have all of that ready, and in the next session I'm going to give you guys all of that information. But whenever I do that, I put myself at great risk, because that means I'm doing a presentation on the internet, and that's like the scariest thing, to know you're talking all day based on an internet connection. But we'll get there. Okay. So you have an InfoPath form here. So this is a basic form where I want to collect data from users. One of the things that I really want to highlight to you guys is it's a pretty simple form, but there's a lot of logic in it that's going to keep people from doing things. So the first thing I want to show you is that I have a message on the bottom that says only expenses greater than $1,500 need to be submitted for approval. So already on the form, until they actually put in values that are greater than $1,500, they're going to get this message that says, hey guys, you're not supposed to be doing this. So I'm using things within the form to guide the behavior that I want to do. So as I have my InfoPath form here, what will happen is if I go in and fill in information, if I put in $400, I'm still going to have that message on the bottom because my total is not greater than $1,500. If I come over here and put in 4,000, whoops, clicked the wrong page. Okay. Now, once that total updates and I come down here, I have an option to save the form. So if I'm saving the form, so if I come over here and just save this form here, it's going to close the form for me. It's going to be an in-progress form. So I've built a solution that I'm allowing them to save the form back to where we started. It's an in-progress expense report. I can click on it, it will reopen, and I can continue to enter the data. So by doing this, I'm going to enforce the behavior that I'd like to get out of the form. How this form works is until all of the fields that I've deemed as required, until all of those are displayed, they're not going to have an option to submit the form. So we're going to use different design elements within the form to keep it so that they can't do things we don't want them to do. So for instance, I'm going to come up here, I'm going to enter in my data. We still down here just have the save the form. But as I enter in all of these additional pieces of data, notice now I can submit the form and save the form. So we're using different pieces of logic within our form in and of itself to drive user behavior. So that's kind of what we want to get to with InfoPath, is more than us just wanting to collect data from the user, we want to drive the behavior of the user. And there's a couple of visual things that we can do to, again, cue the right behavior. If they don't see a button that says save until they can save, or submit until they can submit, they're not going to submit it at a part of the process we don't want them to do. But instead of just not showing them the button at all, we're showing them conditional statements. So if it's less than $1,500, just go use your P card and buy it. So there's different things like that. And so we can guide behavior through the system to try to increase user adoption. Okay, so now I can go through and I can submit the form. Okay, once I submit the form, it's no longer showed up at the top, but it's going to be shown down at the bottom as being a form that has been submitted. So a user can always go to the site, They can see, okay, what forms do I have in progress? Because, maybe I don't have all of the details. I need to get it approved, but I'm going to start on it. I have to go to a meeting. I want to be able to save it, go back in and change it, make changes to it later. Once I submit a form, we cannot go back in and necessarily change it. So if I go back, I'm going to open up the expense report, open up the library, so we can go in and click on the one that we just did. And now when I click on the form, I see all of the data that I put in there. And at the bottom, the request has previously been submitted and the status is equal to submitted. So once they submit the form, I use that logic again to hide what they can do with the buttons. So even if they get into a form that they've already done, they're not going to be confused because they don't see a save button, they don't see a submit button, they only see the pieces of information that are relevant to what they're doing. And so ultimately, these are the types of things we want to do with InfoPath, is we want to look at, okay, it's a tool that can allow us to build forms, but it's so much more than that. If we just wanted to give people a piece of paper where they could enter in data, we could do that inside of Word. We could do that inside of Excel. We could do that inside of all of the tools that we're already used to using. And so one of the great advantages of using InfoPath is this logic that I can put behind it with the whole point of driving user behavior. And so far, all of the things that I've talked about are all about driving user behavior. It's nothing to do with the logic yet. So a lot of times when we think about InfoPath, we think about data in and data out. Where's the data going to go? How am I going to process the data? But there's this whole additional layer on top of it that's going to allow you to put things into it to drive proper user behavior. And I'm not sure about your users, but my users are sometimes a little bit hard to drive them to do what I want to do. If there's a button, they're going to click it. I'm like that though too. I was standing yesterday in London and there was a bell and I just rang it, not for any reason except for there was a string, and I was like, oh, I'm like one of those people. So it's expected that they do that. And so one of the great things we can do with the tools that we have is to hide and control those behaviors. So we're going to look in InfoPath and look at doing some of these different things. So there's a couple of different ways that we do this inside of InfoPath, and it's all based on some very simple concepts. You have a section inside of InfoPath, and then you have rules on that section to say when are you shown and when are you hidden. And so when you open up a lot of my forms inside of InfoPath, there will be a ton of different informational sections and then data that's going to show and trigger when things are shown and when things are displayed. So we're going to jump in really quick and look at some of the basics inside of InfoPath. And we are going to go back to our PowerPoint presentation and just jump back and look at some of these different things. Okay. So we're going to look at the basics of InfoPath. When you start with InfoPath, you end up with basically a blank screen. And from there, you have to put in a page layout. Your page layout is what you guys are going to use to insert your fields that people are going to enter data in. What's great about InfoPath is when you're using these page layouts and these form layouts and these different controls, InfoPath has a way to theme everything together. So if you change your colors in one area, it's going to change them in all of them. Okay? Once you have your form layouts, you put your controls inside of your layouts. So we have these different elements here. We can input fields, objects, or containers. Containers are the way that you can take an entire subset of data and hide and display it. Okay. So pulling it all together, we end up with a blank form. And then on top of that form, we put in a layout. And then on top of that layout, we put different fields. So we basically design a form in InfoPath and then associate a form with a SharePoint library. So we build this form in InfoPath. We have a blank form. We put layouts on it. We put fields in it. And then we say, I want to associate you. I want to publish you to a SharePoint library. And by doing that, what you're able to do is say, whenever anyone goes to this library and says new item, open my form. And that's really what you're doing. By associating a form with a SharePoint library, you're putting an entry point where people can then open your form. All right, so inside of InfoPath, This is a new SharePoint form. So if I was just to come in here and say new, come over here and do a SharePoint form library and say design the form, it's going to give me a form that already has some elements on it. So Microsoft likes to help me out when I get started with things. So it likes to assume, oh, you want to do a form, I'm going to give you this layout to try to get you started. We can either keep this layout, come over here and delete the whole thing. So we can kind of build this form any way that we want to. We come over here to page design, and the first thing we can do is pick a layout that we want to put for our page. So we may come over here and decide, well, I want the bar down the side. I'm going to put these different pieces in here. So at this point, we're not really doing anything with specific fields or anything like that. We're just working on some of these design elements. So we have this form here, and once we do that, we have a collection of tables that we can input there. So we can come over here and pick any one of these that we want. Depending on what we pick is going to determine how it looks on the page. So for instance, some of them are going to be white, solid background, some of them are going to be colored backgrounds. So we can spend a lot of time building and designing what this form looks like. You can spend a lot of time doing this, and that's why I say it's good to do mock-ups first, because you can spend a lot of time doing this, and then they decide they want something different, and you have lost a lot of time. So it's fairly easy to do, but it's still much better to do it on a mock-up first so you kind of get an understanding of what you would like them to do with it. So right now, we haven't put any data on this form. We have simply worked on a layout. We can also go in under page design, and we have all of these different color schemes that we can use. I am not sure whose job it is to come up with color schemes at Microsoft, but there's some pretty ugly forms in here. So should you want like a bright pink and purple, I could give you a bright pink and purple form. I guess there could be a company that had bright pink and purple. I'm sorry if any of you guys have bright pink and purple as your primary colors. But again, you can go in and build the different forms. Most of the time when I work inside of an organization, we basically pick the Microsoft InfoPath theme that is the closest to our organization colors, and then just tell everybody to use that same thing. So number one question I get is, well, we went and spent all of this money branding SharePoint. We have all of these custom things. Can we apply that to InfoPath? Not really. They tried, not really. Not without a great deal of effort and custom code to build custom office themes and different things like that. And in most cases, not totally worth it. If you're going to end up in a scenario like that where branding is very important, it's probably better to just have plain vanilla InfoPath forms and then display them on a SharePoint site so everything looks the same. So not necessarily easy to make it match the branding, but it works pretty well even if you keep it vanilla. So, yes, sir?
Do you know if that's changed in SharePoint 2013?
Oh, the first question of the day. It has not changed. So let's talk about InfoPath for a second. How many of you guys are heavy InfoPath users in 2010? Okay. InfoPath 2013 has no technical changes. So there are no new feature sets in InfoPath 2013. If you ask anyone inside of Microsoft, in fact, I challenge you to ask anyone inside of Microsoft, what is your form story for 2013? And the answer will be InfoPath is our form story for 2013. And then you'll say, but nothing changed in InfoPath. And they will respond with, well, InfoPath is our story for 2013. So that being said, as of right now, InfoPath is still the story, but nothing has changed. There are no really hardly any, if there is any, they're like very minuscule changes from 10 to 13. So everything works basically the same way that it works now. So if you read between the lines as to what happens with other Microsoft products when they do that, I think it leaves a little room to wonder what will happen with the form story going forward. Most of your forms will update. When I say most, There's a session later this week that Lori Gowan is doing that talks about the prep that you're going to have to do to get your forms to 2013. I would say even if you have no plans to migrate in the near future, you should still be in that session to hear some of the things that you have to do. A lot of the changes that are happening are around things like claims-based authentication versus standard authentication that's used now. And so there's some differences in how you can interact with the user profile services and different things like that. So I highly recommend going and checking out that session if you're a heavy InfoPath user. It's a good question, though. I usually take bets to see how long it's going to take me in my session before I get to tell the InfoPath story. I love it, though. Okay. So once we have our form here, we're going to go and we're going to create different controls on the page. Now, I have been using InfoPath for years. This is probably one of my favorite things that I do inside of InfoPath to make my life easier. Because I spend time doing mock-ups before I ever go build the form, when I go to build my form, that means I pretty much know all of the data fields that are going to be on my form before I ever get started. And so what I do is I go over to the fields control, and I come over here and I add starting with groups. So I may come over here and add a group called expense data, and then I might come over here and put information about that. Okay? And so instead of so we can get all of these different types of fields here, but instead of coming up here and just dragging and dropping fields down on the form, and then having all of these different ones where it says field 1 and field 2 and field 3, I actually take the time to build out a structure using groups so I can put data together. Where this becomes helpful is if you ever need anyone else to look at your form. If you're trying to troubleshoot and you can't find it, you end up with these different groups, and then you can go in and see like data together, and then you can understand what's going on with the form. I also spend a lot of time doing hidden fields inside of a form. So a lot of the logic I do with should this be displayed, should this be visible, what field should equal what, a lot of that is done with data that needs to be part of the form, but never ever needs to be shown to the user. They don't necessarily need to see a big box that says this is what the status is, but I may need to know what the status is so that I can hide and display things. So most of the time what I do is I come over here and I create a group, and I call it a hidden group. So I come over here and call group, and then I put all of the fields that I'm using on the form for my logic that I'm not displaying on the form, I put them in this group. That way when I go back and I'm trying to troubleshoot, things are very clear to me as to where the data is. So this is one approach that I've used to building forms that has saved me so much time in the future, because I'll build a form and then I won't hear that anything is not working with the form until I hear something's not working with the form, and then all I hear is that the form is not working until I get the form working. So it can be working great until it's not, and then I have to go back in and fix it. Well, if that's been 6 months, I've done how many InfoPath forms in between? I have no memory of exactly what we did. So the more I can do along the way to program as I'm going into it and to really build this in a structured way, the easier things are going to be in the future. So I'll spend a lot of time doing this. Some of my most common fields in here are the file name, because I always have a file name field that I'm going to use to set the name of the file. This is one thing, though, that you want to do before you publish the InfoPath form. Okay? So if you have a form back at your office and you want to go back and say, well, it would be really great if I started to do things around. Be very careful. Forms that already exist with a data structure that's already set do not like to be moved, and you could end up breaking your form. So you really want, if you want to go with this type of approach, I would recommend you go with it for new forms that you're getting started with, or forms where there's not a lot of data, so if any of the data gets lost, it's not going to impact the forms that you have. So you want to be very careful with that. Okay. we are supposed to go to 10:45. Okay, perfect. Time just flies. Okay. Once we have these items here, we can go ahead and drag them over and put them on the form. One thing I want to show you guys about InfoPath that makes it awesome is the way that you drag is going to determine how things go on the field. So if you notice, when I drag it over here and they're next to each other, it's going to put my label next to my field. If I drag it just within that one box, it's going to put my label above the field. And so that's a little trick that just makes working with InfoPath nice, because you spend a lot of time going through the trouble of saying, oh my, now I've put this here and I need to back up and remove a label and put it back. And so just by dragging and dropping, you can determine where things go on the field. Yep. So while you're here, when you drag it over, if it highlights two rows next to each other, it's going to put them next to each other. If it doesn't do that, and it's also a little bit sensitive, but you get used to it once you go, it's going to put them on top of each other. Yeah. That's a fun little trick inside of InfoPath that makes life a little bit easier. I love it when life is a little bit easier. Okay. I am going to try to open up this form inside of InfoPath again. I was having a few issues with it, which it might have been my internet connection that dropped. So let me try to open this again. See if I can get this to open. So I can show you some of the different sections and different things like that. While we're waiting, let's see if it's going to let me. It's just getting stuck. Okay. I'm not going to take the time to get it. What we can do now with this form is we can publish it to a SharePoint library. So I'm going to come over here. And I'm going to take the form and I'm going to publish it. So we've built the form, we've put the field controls on it. Now we want to associate it with a SharePoint library. The only thing that we're doing at that point is saying whenever someone goes to this library, show them the form. So when they hit new item, it's going to show them the form. So we're going to pick SharePoint Server. It's going to ask me if I want to save it first, and I do. So I'm going to say OK. I'm going to just save it locally. And then I'm going to go in and enter the URL of the site that I want to put the form on. I'm going to give it a second to connect. Thinking. Anyone have any questions while we're waiting on the...
If you're only using standard, will it kick up a fuss at this point?
Will it what?
If you're only using standard, will it kick up a fuss when you're trying to upload the...
No, it will never connect. So if you're only using standard, you won't have the ability to publish as a web form, but you'll have the ability to still associate to a form library. It will just require that when they open the form that they have the InfoPath client installed. So you go through the same process whether you have standard or enterprise. And in the publishing process, you get to say, do I want to make this a web-enabled form? And you can't make it a web-enabled form if it's not an enterprise server. Yep, good question. All right.
You said there's no changes with InfoPath 2013. That means that it still can't work with management.
Yes. Isn't that sad? Yes, it still does not work with managed metadata. You are to a valid URL. Okay, we'll let this go. Yeah, so it still doesn't work with managed metadata, which is a little bit tricky. A little bit unfortunate, but yeah, I was really hoping that that one was going to come through. I think that Microsoft has a trick up their sleeve. They have to. They have to have a form story. They know they have to have a form story. I just don't think it's with the rest of the product set yet. So I think that we'll see something come out of it. I think we're in a little holding pattern to see exactly what that is. Yes, sir.
Just on that, I don't have the details, but one of the InfoPath MVPs posted an answer on one of the forums recently saying that there was some form of web service which you could call to in SharePoint use a solution for that. I'd be very surprised if it was as straightforward as he was making out, however.
Yeah.
And he's not published an example yet.
Yeah, I looked at what he did just last week, and so the way that I define an out-of-the-box solution is that it requires no syntax and no semicolons. And so as soon as you get to a point where you require syntax or semicolons, in my mind, that is no longer an end-user out-of-the-box solution. So when I reviewed his solution and my head started to spin at the hoops I had to jump through to get it, I thought, you know what? I'm not so much thinking this is going to be something I'm going to recommend for people to do. But yes, there's supposedly this web service that you can get it, but again, not sure how much value that's actually going to be. So, yes, sir. Have I what? I have not. Oh, bless your heart. Anytime you try to get around the licensing issues and I try to get around spending money for Microsoft, things break. I mean, there's really no way around it. The licensing's there for a reason. I mean, I know you can get around some of it. I haven't used that tool, no. No. That's an interesting one, though. All right, let's see if it's going to let me get it. This is very not cool, InfoPath. There we go. There we go. Maybe. It's looking a little happier. My stance, so my personal stance on InfoPath Forms in 2013 is to just move forward wisely. One of the things that caused me a lot of pain and trouble and heartache in 2010 was when I really tried to make InfoPath do more than what I think InfoPath was meant to do. Anything with advanced logic and all of these crazy things and all of this stuff as big as I can think I can do it in InfoPath. Usually as big as I could think I could do it in InfoPath was as big as I could think I could break it. And so it became very difficult. I still to this day have an HR onboarding system that is built in InfoPath, and my heart sinks every time we have to make a change to this form. It's a form that then kicks off another form that kicks off, and it's just crazy. And if I could do that whole thing again, I would start over and get buddy-buddy with the developer because the logic in it was never meant to be done in an out-of-the-box tool. And so where I'm going with 2013 is when I get to those projects and I'm really starting to understand what's the depth of the logic, I really start to evaluate, is InfoPath the right tool? How I'm stepping forward with 2013 and InfoPath is, if I don't mind losing it, I'm gonna lose it on my computer in just a second. It's okay, we will plan B this. We'll just open up a VM. Not a problem.
So the cloud isn't the solution to all the problems after all.
Oh goodness, I'm gonna kick this bad boy in just a minute. You wait till we have a 15-minute break. I'll have a totally different demo when you guys come back. So if I don't mind losing it, and not losing it, so let's say that I'm going forward, I'm moving ahead, I'm building forms in InfoPath, and then they come out with a new solution that says, hey, we want to build forms this way. If I've only lost an hour or two of time, if I've only lost a day of my life because I'm rebuilding a form and it's simple and easy enough to rebuild, then I don't mind. If I have to start from scratch and completely rebuild an HR onboarding system, I would be more careful to proceed in 2013. So I'm also going to communicate that up and say, okay, am I going to do this? Am I not going to do this? Talk to management and say, okay, I've decided to do this, but there's limitations in 2013, so we're going this way, but no, as things happen, we might need to rebuild things. The beauty of InfoPath is that it's a quick and easy tool to work with, so it's really a time management thing. I would also say, though, starting in 2010, even if I'm not upgrading, I would start to seriously consider the complexity of the things I'm doing in 2010 to make sure that I'm in alignment with where the product set is going. So it's an interesting conversation there. Look at this. We have an InfoPath solution on this one. This is a travel request one. So we'll just switch to another one. I'll show you this open form, and we will. And I did this on purpose, right? Let's see. To show you that the beauty of InfoPath is that you do the same things over and over and over. So I may apply something to one solution. I'm going to use those same concepts in every other solution that I do. So once you learn to do it one time, you can just take those same things and apply them over and over. So this is a travel request solution similar to our expense request, in that when we have a field that they put here, we have some different sections that show up depending on the type of conference you pick. So they have a travel request, and depending on the type of conference they pick, if it's a training one, the training details section comes up. If it is a conference, the conference one comes up. So when we're here and on the library, and we come down and we add a new document, it's going to come up, and then based on what we pick, so if I pick conference, it's going to come up and ask me the conference details. So that's similar into the one that we showed, where the buttons were only showing and hiding based on different fields in the form. And so how you do this is through a control on the form called a section. So we have an entire section here. So it's one of our controls that we can put. And then it's the concept of rules inside of InfoPath. We can come over here and do a rule, say manage the rules. And you can do formatting, action, or validation. So every control that's inside of InfoPath allows you to add these elements to increase the user experience with it. So the idea behind this is you're going to use validating to drive user behavior. This would, when you think validation, think of a phone number. If someone puts an email in when it should be a phone number is a very specific pattern. If it doesn't match that pattern, let them know that they put in the wrong data. You're trying to drive the right user behavior. Formatting, you can disable things. You can highlight things. A lot of times I'll go in and highlight if there's certain values that exceed a number. I'll highlight if they enter in something that's a certain thing where I just want them to take note. And then action is going to be where you can do something with the form. So the piece of the form that we've talked about so far is the publishing. So we're going to come over here, publish it, and associate it with the SharePoint library. And I know this one's going to work because this one is not connected to the internet at all. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so we have our SharePoint URL in here. We're putting it to a form library. This is the field where it says enable this form to be filled out using a browser. You couldn't select this if you were using standard. We're going to go to a form library. Whoops. You can publish to a form library, which means associate this form with this form library. If I go to a content type, it's going to put it into a content type gallery, and then anywhere that that content type gallery is consumed, you can use that form. So if I have a single form that I want to put in multiple locations where anytime they go to the library, they can go to the drop-down, and it's always going to open that same form, I could publish it as a content type. I will say from experience that that has been very confusing for my users. My users may tell me that I want to go anywhere and open anything and do anything, but as soon as I give them the same thing in multiple places, they're now all of a sudden confused because, well, how come I can get to the same thing in different places, but it's really a different thing? So again, you want to use those features based on your audience, and if your audience needs that functionality, then you would want to do that. An administrator-approved template means that your form has got something in it that needs to be approved by your IT pros, your system administrators before it would run. I don't like to do these. InfoPath is nice, but InfoPath is not a development tool, in my opinion. This is not what you'll get from Docs. This is Jen Mason's opinion. Whenever I have to write code in InfoPath, almost always I can go get a .NET developer to write me an equivalent solution with a lot less pain and a lot less heartache. So I do not personally do any code inside of InfoPath. It's one of those things that just because you can doesn't always mean you should. And in the beginning, when I could, I did, and then I regretted it, and now I don't. So that's kind of where that one's been learned from the trenches. I don't know, have any of you guys experimented with code inside of InfoPath? Is it as painful as I'm making it out to be? Yes. I've got some witnesses in the back that are giving me 2 thumbs up. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it without approval from a developer. That's what I would say. I would go as far as I can, but if there's anything I need to do that I can't do with InfoPath out of the box, again, I would have the right conversations. I would go to my SharePoint team and say, here's the business problem that I'm trying to solve. Here's what we need to do. Help me with this piece that's missing. I can't do it inside of the tool sets that I have. How would you do it? And then you might come up with a mixed solution. There's plenty of hybrid solutions, but it's usually easier for a .NET developer to not have to deal with code inside of InfoPath. Okay. The beauty of InfoPath, though, is if you accidentally do something inside of your form that requires that, you won't be able to select any other option but that. So it's very easy for you to know if you've fallen into that category. So InfoPath does a good job of telling you along the way. We're going to say what library do we want to associate the form with, or we could create a new library from here. Then we're going to go in and take fields that have been filled out in the form and make them columns inside of our SharePoint library. So why would we want to do that? So that we can use them later inside of a workflow. So I basically want to pull them out of my InfoPath form and use them as columns so they can be used in a workflow. They can be used with views. They can be used with sorting and filtering. And so I'm only going to pull out the fields that I need to sort, filter, or use in a workflow. I don't necessarily want to pull out every field because then I'm going to end up with a ridiculously long list that brings no business value. So I want to pull out the ones that make the most sense. I also, this is another thing that I do, is before I create the columns inside of InfoPath and publish them up, I go to my list inside of SharePoint and I create all of my columns in that list before I ever go through this publishing process. So as you start working with InfoPath, notice that there's a way here that if I say add, I can create a new column in this library. Doing that creates an InfoPath column in a library and not a SharePoint column. One would think, well, these are the same things. A column is a column, right? A column is not a column. An InfoPath column and a SharePoint column are different. And the only time it matters is that when I want to do sorting, grouping, filtering, if I want to change the way it's displayed. If it's a SharePoint column, it's going to behave all of the ways that you think a column would behave. If it's an InfoPath column, it's going to behave slightly differently. So one trick of the trade that I always do is I never create a column from InfoPath. Instead, I go to the SharePoint list, I create all of my columns there, then I push the InfoPath information to the column. It's a little bit tricky, but that's just how I do it. The other thing I would say is, and this is a fun one too, a people column in InfoPath is not a people column inside of a SharePoint list. They look the same, they act the same. So it's kind of like one of those, if it looks like a duck and talks like a duck and smells like a duck, it's a duck. That's not true when it comes to the InfoPath people column. So what you cannot do is create a people column inside of InfoPath and say, hey, take this value and put it inside of a people column inside of SharePoint. It's just something that's not supported. So the way around that is one of those questions that I always ask is, how much do you really need it? Because if you really need it, the way around that is to populate it up to a text column and then run a workflow that converts text to people. So there are a couple of ways around it, but it's like jumping up and down backwards twice to get to the solution. And sometimes it's worth it if it causes a lot of business value. Like for instance, if I need to be able to sort on where manager equals me. Well, that's a great SharePoint feature that happens on a people field. So if I need to do things like that, then it's going to make sense to go to that extra effort. If I'm never going to use that field for anything else, it makes sense to just leave it as text and then hide it from the display. So again, there's different things that you can do with those. Okay. So we're going to go through and pick all of our fields. Once we do that, we're going to publish it, and this associates it with the library. The only thing that we have done at this point, though, is said go to the library so that when they open it, they're going to fill out the form. So we've only solved half of the problem, right? So the next thing we need to do is, okay, well, now once they fill out the form, what do we do with it? Okay? So how that is done inside of InfoPath is what's known as data connections. And data connections can go two ways. I can receive data or I can push data. In most scenarios, I'm receiving data from a SharePoint list. So I might have a drop-down and I want it to populate from a SharePoint list. You can get very creative, though, with how you retrieve data. So for instance, on this one, on this form that I have down here, when I click on Travel Request History and I click on that, it's going to retrieve data from the list and show me all of my travel history. So this is a data connection I've done to consume data inside of my form. Okay? The other type is where we're going to push data. And that's most likely going to happen through the use of, clicking a button. I'm going to click on the button and I'm going to send the data somewhere. So when we're inside of InfoPath, we're going to have data connections. I'm going to say modify this. Let me do a new one first so you can see. So come up here so we can receive data or submit data. If I say submit data and say next, do I want to send it to a web service, a document library, an email message, or a hosting environment? Sending it to an email is good, except for a lot of the data connections and things that you can do inside of a form are not supported inside of the email. So really, the only time I ever submit anything through an email is if I just want them to have a quick and easy snapshot of stuff, and then usually somewhere in there I have to give them a link that takes them back to the InfoPath site and where the InfoPath form is, because if I actually want them to do something, they can't do it inside of the email form. Most of the time, it simply goes to a document library and a SharePoint site. So I'm going to come over here and say next. I'm going to put in the URL of where I want to go, and I'm going to put in the form name. So I'm going to come over here and show you this on this one. And we're going to see that I'm doing a concat of the name of the account name and the start date. So what we're doing here is we're building out the file name for what we want the file to be. So one thing to notice about SharePoint is that everything is dependent on that file name, right? So file name must be unique. So something we want to be careful with the file name is that we come up with something that's unique, and we want to be very careful with this box that says allow overwrite if the file exists, because we want to make sure that we want them to overwrite it or we don't want them to overwrite it. It also means that if we want them to be able to open a form and save it back, that we want to make sure, however we're concatenating the name or however we're building that name, that it's something that it's going to support them resaving over the existing name. So one thing you don't want to do is say, allow them to resave it over the existing name, but I need a unique file name, so I'm going to come over here and pick the function of now, because now is always going to give me a unique number. But if I use now, and every time the file goes to save, your now is always going to be different. So you won't actually be saving over the same name. So you just want to make sure you think through these different things as you're building out the form to make sure you get all of the right pieces. Okay. So we're going to go through, pick our file name. Once we have that, we simply have our data connection, but we haven't done anything with the data connection. So what we want to do is usually in most cases we're going to have a button. This is what's known as the picture button. So this is a little bit different than in 2010 or 2007. You just had a regular button. In 2010 you have what's called the picture button, which really allows you to put it on the page and add an image to it, and you can never underestimate the power of an image. People like images. Somehow it makes them smile inside, and then they're all happy they can fill out the form. Once we have the image there, we are going to add a rule to it to where we can submit with it. So we have an action rule, and we're going to run these actions. In my case, I'm setting a field's value to something. Then I'm going to submit using a data connection, and that's that data connection that we just created. So what you're able to do then is go through and figure out, okay, the first part is building the form and associating it to the library so that users will go to that library, say new, and it's going to open the form. The second step then is going through and saying, okay, I have this form, what do I want to happen once it's done? And that's by adding a submit button or a submit function to the form so that they can go to the form, submit it, and it's going to do whatever you want with it. In most cases, it's going to publish it to a SharePoint library. So in our solution here, let me get to the library here. So we just have this single form here, and so we're going to be putting up the values that are there, okay? This is just one phase of it. Once these values are here, then we're going to use the other features inside of SharePoint to do other things with it. So we may use the other features inside of SharePoint, like in the next session, we're going to look at Visio services. How are we going to use Visio services to connect to the data that's in this list so we can actually create these visual elements? So we have those different things that we're going to do with that. So this is just the basis that we're going to now build upon for the rest of the different sessions. So I think I'm supposed to let you out now. I could talk for like 10 more hours about InfoPath. Is that right? Is it time? Yes, because I think, don't you guys get coffee now? And everyone needs coffee. So hopefully this has been helpful to you guys. Do you guys have any questions about the different pieces? Like I said, next we're going to take these columns that we have and we're actually going to link the columns with a Visio diagram so that when I click things in the Visio diagram based on the values in the list, it's going to show me different things. So we've got this foundation that we're going to now continue to build upon for the rest of the day. So we'll take a quick break. I'm going to go beat my site into submission, and hopefully I'll see you guys in 15. Thanks, guys.